Yeah.
So I thought I might just go back to last week because someone asked a question about whether there was anything that you could eat to help directly with stress and anxiety. So I just went back and checked the literature to see if there'd been any updates or anything that I'd missed. And I guess overwhelmingly, when we come to some of these mental health issues and cognitive function and those sorts of things, the evidence basically says that a good quality diet seems to be important, but identifying any particular characteristic from that diet is hard to sort of pin down. So it basically reinforces that if we have a good quality diet, especially with a good quantity of vegetables, legumes, nuts, seeds and fish, then that's supportive of good mental health and particularly anxiety, and staying away from what we're now calling ultra processed foods, or those, junk food, the highly processed foods with lots of additives. That seems to be negative. But I did sort of pick up on a couple of studies that were kind of interesting in the literature. And one of them was a meta-analysis looking at whether B vitamins have any role to play in stress and anxiety. Because if you go into a supplement shop, B vitamins are the supplement that are often prescribed if anyone's saying, look, I'm feeling a bit anxious or stressed. And the reason is because they're tied in with carbohydrate metabolism, and they're also potentially involved in a number of different metabolic reactions in the body that could ultimately lead to changing levels of things like homocysteine and dopamine and serotonin. So there's, I guess, a plausible reason why they might impact on things like anxiety. But yeah, not a lot of evidence over the years that has directly shown that. So this particular study was published just last year, and it was a meta-analysis of 12 studies, and all these studies investigated whether supplementing with B vitamins had any effect on anxiety. And so the vitamins that they looked at were B6, B12 and folate. And basically what this study found was that there was a small beneficial effect on stress. So people who were feeling stressed after taking these supplements for various lengths of time generally found that they felt their stress levels had improved. But the effect was more likely to occur if someone had a poor dietary intake in the first place, which is what we typically find with diet studies, that if your dietary intake is good, having a supplement on top of it generally doesn't offer any beneficial effect. But if your diet quality is poor and you use a supplement to bring your levels up to optimal, then you can get some beneficial effect. So this meta-analysis basically said that from a stress point of view, possibly taking a B vitamin supplement might be useful. And when they looked at things like depressive symptoms and anxiety, in this particular meta-analysis, they didn't find any beneficial effect. So depending on what your issue is, then potentially using a B vitamin supplement might be useful. But from my perspective, even better would be to increase the intake of foods that provide those B vitamins. And so they're basically things like whole grains, B12 comes from animal foods, so meat, eggs, dairy, and then all the legumes, the leafy green vegetables, the fruit, those sorts of plant foods. So again, it just ties back into that message that a good quality diet, good variety of plant foods, not too heavy on the animal foods, is going to be supportive of anxiety. So the other interesting study that came up was a study that was a randomized controlled trial where they directly looked at what would happen if we gave people with anxiety a particular probiotic supplement. And so this one had 111 participants, and they're all identified as having moderate depression and anxiety to start with. And they gave them all a supplement that had a particular strain of lactobacillus in it. So it was Lactobacillus Plantarum in a fairly high dose, and they had that for 12 weeks. And at the end of this 12 weeks, they reported some positive improvements in the people who had had the supplement in terms of cortisol levels, stress and anxiety scores, and also some improvements in things like memory. So this small randomized controlled trial basically showed that this particular probiotic supplement did have a beneficial effect in this really controlled environment. So the species they use, the Lactobacillus Plantarum, it's a species that we can identify in the gut. And when we're looking at gut biome and all those sorts of things, it can be identified as something that's in the gut. And people who have a higher dose of some of these particular supplements or higher level naturally in their gut generally have some better health outcomes. But I guess the question is, if you want this effect, how do you obtain this particular organism? And if you wanted to directly obtain it, you'd basically have to have this particular high dose supplement. or there's possibly having a higher intake of some of the fermented foods, so things like kimchi and sauerkraut, brined olives, those sorts of things, pickles, might help to stimulate increased growth of this particular bacteria. So they're just a couple of studies that I sort of picked up directly related to anxiety. And I guess in the research, you can find all these pockets of studies which show that under certain conditions, this one might have an impact, that one might not. And what I'm always interested in doing is looking collectively at what that evidence says. And overwhelmingly, it goes back to, well, there's no sort of really strong messages about one particular dietary component being important, other than having a good varied diet in lines with, you know, our normal health guidelines, more emphasis on plants, less emphasis on animals. There's any questions about that anxiety side of things or anything that I talked about? No? All good?
Actually, I have a question. Just, I know, you know, highly processed breads, I guess. You know, the packaged breads that you get from the supermarket. Are you better off buying like freshly from the bakery as opposed to those highly processed breads?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it really comes down to how much bread you eat. So in general, I think, you know, bread has been a food that's been demonized with sort of the whole low carb message. And, you know, there's no harm in eating bread. But if you wanted to choose the best quality bread, you'd go for a bread that was less processed. So ideally, you know, whole grain, something that's got some seeds and some, you know, visible chunks of things that you can see in it. But there's also some evidence showing that sourdough bread, so foods that are fermented very slowly, also have some better health properties. So ideally, that's where, you know, when I choose bread, I try to go for a sourdough or a whole grain. And when we're trying to make decisions about individual products, my advice is to have a look at the ingredient list. And you basically want products that have as few ingredients as possible. So the more ingredients that are in that product, and particularly the more ingredients that you don't recognize, like when you start to see things like emulsifiers and, you know, maltodextrins and, you know, colors and things like that, they're the ones that are less likely to have a beneficial effect. So as a very broad rule of thumb, when you're trying to decide between two products, go for the one that has the least ingredients and the one that's been treated as minimally as possible. Okay, so another question that came up was which foods are good for gut health? And I'm assuming this is sort of tied into that whole idea about microbiome, which is quite, you know, getting a lot of attention at the moment. And some people sort of talk about the biome as being this extra organ. So it's so vital to our health that we need to consider it as an organ itself and not just a few bacteria that are floating around in our gut. And there's, you know, lots and lots of research going on at the moment to see, you know, how does the gut biome link to health and what can we do to change the gut biome. And I guess the situation we're at is that generally studies show that people who have better health outcomes have certain characteristics in their biome that are different to people who are less healthy. So we suspect that there's a link between biome and health. In terms of trying to unravel what specifically are the beneficial characteristics, it's a bit harder. And especially if you're trying to find out, well, what can I do myself to alter my diet to have a better biome? That seems to be a bit tricky as well. Like anything, there seems to be a genetic element to it. And then it seems to be that illness has an impact, and whether or not diet has an impact or not is, I guess, less certain at the moment. But there was a good review that was published last year, and it kind of looked collectively at all the ways in which diet can affect biome. And basically the strongest message that comes out is that fibre is really important. And mostly when we look at, on a population level, how much fibre Australians consume, we typically don't consume enough. So that's one thing that most people can work on, is increasing their fibre intake. And it's not just increasing the amount of fibre, but it's improving the variety of fibre that you have in your diet. So within foods, we have both soluble and insoluble fibres, and different foods provide different types. So the best thing is to have a really good variety of fibre types. So from all the plant foods, the whole grains, all those sorts of things. And that seems to have the strongest effect on a positive gut biome. And then there are ideas about Fodmaps. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this term Fodmaps, but it's quite popular at the moment. And there are some researchers down in Monash who are doing a lot of research looking at Fodmaps, and they're now producing a whole range of foods. So I think you can even go to places like Baker's Delight at the moment, and you can buy a low FODMAP bread. So the idea of Fodmaps is that there are certain types of carbohydrate that we can't digest as well as others. And so these pass from the small intestine into the large intestine, where they get fermented by bacteria. Now, generally that fermentation is a good thing because it produces all sorts of substances and gases, short-chain fatty acids like butyrate and acetate, and these are thought to have a very beneficial effect on the lining of the gastrointestinal tract, so they protect against colon cancer, and they're also linked to, you know, increasing the oxygenation within the cells in the gut, improving satiety, all these sorts of things. So generally that fermentation is a good thing, but some people seem to be a little sensitive to it, and they find that they get excessive gas production in particular, and that can exacerbate symptoms like irritable bowel syndrome and those sorts of things. So for some people, they seem to get relief from reducing their intake of some of these FODMAP foods. So that might be things like onions, leek. For some people, it's lactose in dairy products. So there's a sort of a whole range of foods, and it's usually about identifying the ones that you are more sensitive to and then removing them from your diet. So with FODMAPs, if you're a sensitive person, then it's useful to identify the things that are triggers for you and try to reduce your intake of them. But this review basically says if you're trying to avoid these sorts of foods and you're not sensitive, then that could be a negative, because some of this fermentation is protective and helpful. And so I guess on the same vein, you know, there's a lot of attention to gluten-free at the moment. And certainly if you have celiac disease, you should avoid gluten. But otherwise, if you're not sensitive to gluten, you don't have celiac disease, then there's no reason why anyone should avoid gluten. And in actual fact, having that gluten in your diet might actually be a positive thing. So I guess the message from this review is to keep your intake of fibre relatively high and not avoid any food components unless you have a direct medical reason for doing that. The review does support the use of probiotics, so probiotic supplements does come out as being something that could be useful for some people. And then there are all these ideas about prebiotics. So this is about eating certain foods that might then increase our normal natural production of some of these components and improving the biome. And the evidence there is a bit mixed. So, you know, often it's the fermented foods and those and the fibrous foods, but there's nothing concrete in the evidence at the moment that identifies that, yes, we should all definitely be eating more of this particular type of thing. From a negative, the message comes out again that processed foods generally associated with a poorer quality gut biome, and artificial sweeteners in particular come out as standing out as something that might be problematic in terms of having a worse quality biome. So that's an interesting one because, you know, people who drink a lot of soft drinks, for example, I'll often say, well, you'd be better off having an artificially sweetened one, so you're not getting all the sugar and kilojoules, but that might therefore go on to negatively impact on their biome. So the best message would be to have less of the high sugar drink in the first place. Yeah, so they're the main things that come out. So strongest message for fibre, more fibre, much better variety of fibre, less of the ultra-processed foods, less of the artificial sweeteners, and then potentially looking at some of the prebiotic foods. But I guess overwhelming the message is about, you know, variety is much more important than any single food. And so the more different types of foods you consume, the more likely you're going to have a better quality gut biome. So a question has just come up, is there any type of testing you can suggest for food allergies? It depends on the allergy that's your concern. So things like egg and fish and some of these sorts of things and nuts, there are direct tests that an immunologist can do. So direct blood tests, skin tests, those sorts of things. If it comes down to things like FODMAPs, if it's the lactose that's an issue, you can do things like hydrogen breath testing, but again, that would be through your doctor and maybe through an immunologist. If you're just concerned that you have an intolerance to certain things, then the way to do that is through what we call an elimination diet. So that's where you can work with a dietitian and you basically take the things out of your diet that you think are a concern, and then you progressively start to introduce them in a systematic way while you're monitoring your symptoms, so you can identify, you know, what things are causing problems and at what level is your problem occur. Allergies and sensitivities are very different. So allergies are when you have a direct immunological reaction to something, and so generally you need to stay away from those substances, whereas sensitivity, usually you can have it up to a certain level. So the recommendation is generally not to avoid it, but to find out what your tolerable level is, and that's where working with a dietitian through that systematic approach can be useful. I guess another thing from the gut health is separate to gut biome, there is some strong evidence showing that a high intake of red meat increases risk of things like colorectal cancer. And so the recommendation at the moment is to have around 350 to 500 grams of red meat per week. Now, if you think about that, that's actually quite a small amount. So most people, well, many people can eat 500 grams of red meat in one good quality steak. So the evidence over the years has actually got stronger for the link between red meat and colorectal cancer. And over time, the amount that's recommended has decreased. So our Australian Guide to Healthy Eating at the moment recommends 500 grams per week. The Heart Foundation just last year came out with an even stronger message and said, no, we really think you should bring it back to 350 grams of red meat per week. And so that's, quite a strong message to consider. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who eats red meat is going to get colorectal cancer, but it does mean that there's a good body of research that shows a strong association between people who have a higher intake and a higher risk of colorectal cancer. So questions that's come up is, if you find out you do have an intolerance and you use like a FODMAP diet, for example, are you stuck with it for the rest of your life? And the good news is no, your tolerance can change. And over time, you can build up a better quality of enzymes and things that can help you cope with some of these sorts of foods. And that's the reason why we say don't avoid it, but try and find the level that you can tolerate, and then continually keep testing that by, increasing it over time. And even the evidence looking at nut allergies, it used to say, if you any family history of a nut allergy, when your baby is born, don't have any foods with nuts, don't give your children nuts. And now the recommendation is it's actually better to have exposure to these sorts of things, because that actually helps improve your tolerance. So yeah, the good message is you're not stuck with it. You can certainly change. And it's about, finding, your individual tolerance. So when I was looking at this question about gut health, I know that's all I want to talk about that. Any questions from that side of things about gut biome? It's a really interesting area of research at the moment, but it's so new and emerging that we're not at the stage where we have these concrete recommendations. It's just, we know a good gut biome is helpful, don't know exactly what are the things that are going to have most impact on improving the quality of your gut biome, but the best advice we can give is have, a really good variety of intake, and particularly make sure that you have that good fibrous intake and stay away from the ultra processed foods. So another question that came through was, is the acidity of foods important, and should any foods be avoided? And when I first read this, I thought, oh, this is about the alkaline diet, which is a diet that's been around for, I don't know, since the early 1900s. And the idea was, if you have foods that have a high acidity level, then you're more likely to increase your risk of things like cancer. So they kind of group foods into acidic foods, which tend to be things like meat and poultry, fish, dairy, eggs, also grains and alcohol. And then there are neutral foods, which are things like just basic fats, starches and sugar. And then the alkaline foods, so things like fruits, grains, legumes, nuts, vegetables. And the idea is, if you have too many of the acidic foods, then that is the problematic factor. So this is a diet that's been around for a long time, and it still gets lots of attention. And I certainly come across people all the time who follow this sort of advice. And so they're, staying away from highly acidic foods and wanting to look at the acidity of foods and, is that going to be harmful or not? And some people even take it down to the level of looking at, well, oranges, tomatoes are acidic foods. Should I be avoiding those? When we look at our body, there's no direct link between having an acidic food and any changes that go on metabolically in the body. So our gut is a very highly acidic environment where we have all this acid floating around, and it's there to help digest our food. And then the pH of our blood sort of stays within a fairly narrow range, and our body's really good at controlling and keeping it within that range because that's what helps metabolism function really well. So although it's an interesting idea, it doesn't sort of have a strong biological mechanism behind it. And when you look at the actual evidence for it, there's very scant evidence in the scientific literature. So there was a systematic review that was done in 2016. And this review, they set out to look at the association between dietary acid load and alkaline water and cancer, because that's mainly where this idea of this alkaline diet comes from, that it's going to be protective or causative of cancer. And they basically did a full systematic review, the whole process that you go through. So they started off identifying that, around 8,500 papers that might be related to the topic. And then by the time they applied all the inclusion criteria, they got down to one study. So over all the years from the 1900s onwards, there's only one study that meets the inclusion criteria to see is diet linked through the alkalinity to cancer. And of the one study they found that there was no association. So it's one of those ideas that I guess people think, well, it makes sense, so maybe I should avoid some of these acidic foods. But when you look at the biological mechanism and you look at the evidence, there's really not a lot of support for it at all. One thing I will say, though, is if you look at the acidic foods and nutrifoods, the alkaline foods, it basically ties in with just general health messages, which are about having, more of the plant foods, less of the animal foods. So from that perspective, it aligns with our general sort of health guidelines. The other thing that I thought when I saw this question about the acidity is maybe people might be thinking about it from the point of view of gout, because some people who experience gout wonder if avoiding some of these acidic foods might actually help. And that's because gout is primarily caused through an increased level of uric acid. And so I guess it makes sense that if you've got this increased level of acid in your body, maybe having less acid in your diet might actually help gout. So I went back and had a look just to update my understanding of gout, make sure it hasn't changed over the years. And basically there's a pretty good review which looks at a clinical update from all the epidemiological evidence, and it was published in 2018. And it basically says that, there are lots of ideas about what might affect gout, but the things that stand out is that it's a weight issue. So primarily reducing body weight, if you're overweight in the first place, is the main thing that can help with gout. If you're not overweight and you're experiencing gout, then there might be some different reasons, and they might be medically related. But from a diet point of view, if you're experiencing gout, the first strategy is to look at your weight and bring your weight down if necessary. And then the other things that stand out are alcohol consumption. So if you're having more than, the recommendations, which is 2 standard drinks per day, you should reduce your alcohol consumption. And another one that comes out is fructose. So if you're having really high intakes of particular fruit or consuming a lot of juice or those sorts of things, then they might trigger as well. So they're the only things that sort of come out from a gout perspective. So interesting, this acidity idea, but from what I've seen, not a lot of evidence behind it. Did anyone have any follow-up questions about that? No? All good? All right. So the only other question that's come through is, what should I eat to support muscle recovery? And I'm assuming this is about acute muscle recovery. So after you've exercised, how can you recover quickly, and possibly how can you avoid that delayed onset of muscle soreness that people often experience when exercising? So the key message for muscle recovery is around protein. And the evidence at the moment suggests that having around 20 to 40 grams of protein in the sort of immediate period after exercise, but also around 20 to 40 grams of protein for each of your meals throughout the day, supports optimal muscle protein synthesis, which also means repair of muscle. The evidence suggests that the quality of protein is important, and particularly leucine is the key amino acid. So we talked about this the other day. So having around 2 to 3 grams of leucine at each of those meals is useful as well, and really distributing your protein evenly across the day. So just as some examples to get that level of leucine, you could have 100 grams of chicken or beef or pork or tuna. You could have 600 mils of milk. You could have 200 grams of eggs or 200 grams of firm tofu. You could have 100 grams of pumpkin seeds, which is quite a large handful, or you could have 300 grams of cannellini beans. So there are a wide range of foods that you can consume. And of course, you can have combinations of these to make up a more tasty meal as opposed to just sitting down and having the one food on its own. But making sure that you've got sort of this level of leucine in particular in your meals across the day supports better muscle protein synthesis and also muscle protein recovery. And I think for Australians, probably the hardest thing is to get that protein in the earlier part of the day. So often our breakfast and our lunch doesn't particularly have these levels of protein in them. And that might be an area where we can all think, you know, well, what could we have for breakfast? So often people skip breakfast, they have a small breakfast, or they might just rely on toast or cereal or something like that. And probably there are some better quality options that we could have in that earlier part of the day. The other thing that's important for muscle recovery is enough carbohydrate to restore the glycogen that you've used, and also make sure you've got the energy to be using the carbohydrate as your fuel source as opposed to using the protein as your fuel source. And then there are some possible ideas that aren't as well substantiated. So there's some ideas about vitamin D, and that's generally about making sure you have a good vitamin D status, not specifically having vitamin D after exercise, but just making sure your vitamin D status is optimal. And throughout Australia, generally, we're finding lots of people actually have quite low vitamin D status, and that could be dependent on where you live and dependent on how much time you spend outdoors. But if you live, you know, sort of in the southern parts of Australia and you don't have a good sun exposure, then potentially your vitamin D status can be poor. So that's something that, you know, is worthwhile checking with your doctor. You have a blood test to check it, and then the way to correct it is a combination of sun exposure. We get some vitamin D through food, but it might be a requirement for supplementation if your levels are particularly low. There are all sorts of ideas about antioxidants, so having more nutrients like vitamin C and vitamin E and foods that provide these. So there's lots of pockets of research about things like berries and pomegranates and tart cherry juice, beetroot juice. So all these sorts of high antioxidant foods might be useful. When we're looking at antioxidants, people are really sort of moving backwards from recommending just single foods or single supplements to improve your antioxidant status, because the antioxidant system in the body is very complex and it interacts in very intricate ways. And so we know that if you have a high dose of one particular antioxidant, you can actually downregulate others. And so to keep things in balance, it's just recommended that you have a variety of foods that are good sources of antioxidants. So generally they're plant foods. Things with lots of colour in them, so fruits and vegetables, those sorts of things. So probably better to, you know, have juices and fruits and those sorts of foods as opposed to the supplemental form of some of these substances. There's some ideas about having things like curcumin and turmeric and those sorts of things. And again, my advice would be to incorporate those into your meals as opposed to having them in a high dose supplement form. There are also ideas about omega-3 fatty acids and that they can have an anti-inflammatory effect. And this is an interesting one because when you exercise, you cause inflammation. And so by having omega-3 fatty acids, maybe you can dampen that inflammation. But the question is, by dampening the inflammation, do you then dampen the adaptation that occurs? So our body adapts by repairing and healing itself as a result of a stress caused through exercise. And although having some omega-3 fatty acids might help to reduce the DOMS that occurs after exercise, then potentially it might also slow down your adaptation. So you're more likely to get that, you know, those DOMS in subsequent exercise situations. So again, instead of having a high dose omega-3 supplement after exercise, my advice would be to look at your diet and make sure you're incorporating foods that have a good omega-3 content in the diet. So fish and some of the seeds and nuts and those sorts of things. So they're the main things that are related to recovery. So primarily thinking about protein, protein quality, protein spread, also making sure you're replacing carbohydrate, and then all the general things that we'd recommend like variety, hydration, those sorts of things. Any questions about that? Okay, so that's all the questions that came through to me. Does anyone have anything else you'd like to ask? Could be related to anything at all. Or if not, maybe I can ask you some questions, because I was really fascinated when Ronnie came to me and started to talk about your sport. And I guess one of the things I love about sports nutrition is being able to, you think about how what we know can be applied to different scenarios. So I guess one of the things I asked was, you know, when I'm trying to work out what I might recommend someone would eat for a particular sport, the things I start to think about are things like body composition, the activity patterns you use and how that might affect your fuel metabolism, and then some of the other things that might specifically be related to your sport in terms of, you know, managing your cognitive function. So I'm interested in your views in terms of body composition. Do you see any benefit to having any particular type of body composition in some of the events that you do? Like, is it better to be lean, muscular, or lighter, or does it not matter? Any ideas?
I think it really depends on the discipline. I think we do have a variety of disciplines in our sport. So maybe, canopy piloting, maybe Andrew might want to answer there, or speed, Shane Turner, or John or Luke might want to answer, because they're probably the ones that might affect their performance. But all the other ones, it's just about being sort of fit. It's not necessarily your size. It's more with the team events about being the same size. It helps, certainly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Hiya. So with canopy piloting, we get quite a range of different body shapes and masses, and because we fly very small parachutes very as fast as we can, so quite a few boys are quite big.
And sorry, can I just, canopy piloting, is that the one where you have to come in and be accurate? Like, I saw pictures of people like sort of going through the water and having to hit certain targets and then land on certain targets. Is that what we're talking about, or is that something different? I'm a bit confused about all the different disciplines.
Yeah, pretty much. There's 3 different disciplines to it: speed, distance, and accuracy. One you're talking about where we drag the water and land in different zones, that's accuracy.
Right.
And for that, it does help to sort of be a bit more sort of lean. But we do have, obviously with speed and distance, we try and go as fast as we can and use that to go and try and go as far as we can and get the best time. So it does help. The heavier person under a smaller parachute can tend to go a little bit faster.
Right.
But that can be a negative accuracy where we can have sometimes quite hard landings.
Do you adjust the parachute size according to your body weight, for example?
Yeah, you can. You can have different sizes of parachutes throughout the whole competition. You can have as many as you want, really.
Right. So I guess if you've got the capacity to do that, then the requirement to be a certain body weight size would be less, because you can adjust your equipment accordingly. Is that how it works?
To a point. I mean, a lot of it depends on the conditions as well. We still can, in accuracy especially, land a bit hard, and I've seen some of the bigger guys have a few more problems with their knees, especially on landing.
Yeah.
But we also have quite a few smaller competitors as well who are doing really well, but you seem they have to work a lot harder at their fitness to do so. And especially in the speed.
And when you say fitness, is it more strength or is it cardiovascular fitness? Like, what elements of fitness most
more
important?
strength. We don't really, I mean, cardiovascular obviously does help, but it's just with especially some of the landings and forcing the parachute around a bit, it does help to be a bit stronger.
Right.
I'm not massively muscular, but I'm quite flexible. It does help a bit as well.
Yep.
Especially in the distance event, but I tend to see a few more bigger guys in canopy piloting.
So in terms of the type of training that you're sort of typically doing outside the jumping component, and sorry if I use the wrong terms, but what other sort of training are you primarily doing? Is it stuff in the gym? Is it running, cycling, or is everyone sort of doing a bit of a different thing?
It's a little bit different. Some people I know don't really do much at all. I try to do a little bit of running or cycling when I could. I didn't really do much gym stuff as such. I was quite happy with that, and a little bit of stretching always helped as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the most important thing out of all of it, because it does take a bit of a toll on your body.
Mm.
And trying to keep the muscles a bit looser and a bit more relaxed does help for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I know a few people who really started up on the whole yoga side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And they seem to be pretty happy with that.
Interesting.
Hi, Michelle. It's Shane Turner here. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can. Hi, Shane.
Yeah. G'day. I perform in speed, which is just head down towards the earth as fast as you can.
Mm-hmm.
The verdict isn't out as far as body shape. There seems to be a bit of an ideal, like heavier, kind of streamlined, less hanging out, I guess, is like more of a solid cylinder is more beneficial. But what I kind of had been doing is having like on competition days, having a kind of hearty breakfast, like generous meal, like talking to one of the wingsuiters, like a weight can play a advantage with them as well. So kind of filling yourself up and not overdoing it is kind of in the morning. But if you did that on every training day, you're going to end up a lot bigger than what you want to be. So I'm just like, how much weight is actually transferred from a big breakfast throughout the day? I know, like, obviously you're always heavier at the end of the day than at the start. So what's your thoughts?
So I guess what you're talking about is by having a physically heavy meal, what impact is that going to have on overall on your weight? And that really comes down to the calorie content or the kilojoule content of the meal. So some foods can be physically heavy, but not necessarily have a lot of kilojoules in them. And this is something that we sort of use a bit in weight making sports like boxing and judo and those sorts of things. When they're trying to reduce their weight, which is the opposite to you, we try to find foods that perhaps as light as possible, but giving them a good number of kilojoules. And it sounds like you're looking for something that's the opposite. So you want something that's heavy, actually make you heavier, without giving you excess kilojoules that are then going to lead to weight gain, I guess, ultimately.
But as well with that, you're not wanting to deter from kind of like your brain function and just feel heavy and like sluggish. You still want to be heightened and feel kind of light and on your toes. It's like a, I don't know. It's like,
it's interesting. I mean, the amount of difference that you're going to get through a meal, depending on what you eat under normal circumstances, it's probably, up to a kilogram, unless you're having some really excessive amounts of food. So I guess you sort of have to weigh up how much benefit am I going to get from having that extra kilogram in my gut, or is it not something that, I don't know, can you,
no, we can't measure that yet, unfortunately, but we're getting, like, basically we're measuring everyone's weight at the start of a competition, just to gather some data to see if there's any correlation between the top runners and their weight versus everyone else. So to be continued, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, because they've been like ski jumping, for example, they went through a period where all their athletes were getting really, really super lean to be as light as possible, so that when they left the ski jump and were in the air, they had much better hover time, basically, because they were so light. And so we had all these ski jumpers who were just getting so unhealthily skinny that it was a real problem. And the way that sport got around it was they just made a rule where you were weighed at the top of the slope and then you allocated skis according to your weight. So if you're a heavier person, you get longer skis. If you're a light person, you get shorter skis. And so that sort of eliminated that advantage that you would get. So there are certainly sports where, you can get these weight advantages in. Same with cycling, I guess, in that, everyone's trying to get the most super light bike. And now regulations have come in and says that, well, bike components have to have a certain weight. So there's no advantage over it. So it'd be interesting to, do some of those studies to see, do you get any advantage having that extra weight or not? And if you don't, then you can just eat something that's comfortable to you and not worry about trying to stuff yourself, I guess, to get a bit of extra weight.
Yeah. Interesting.
Someone's saying maybe we could do a body scan to compare Yeah, so I think you're talking about a DEXA scan there. Looks like Luke said that. Yeah, so DEXA is a way of measuring your body composition, so you can actually determine, you know, how much muscle mass versus fat mass and bone mass you have. So it is a technique that can be used, and it would be definitely interesting in your sport just to profile athletes and see if you all have similar characteristics or if you're very different. If it's just a total mass issue though, then you don't necessarily need to know the body composition to know if your total body weight is going to impact that particular jump. But from a health perspective, you might want to identify, well, okay, these people with a higher muscle mass are actually, you know, doing better, or so that would be an interesting thing to do. I guess if you ever get the chance to come into Canberra for your camp, maybe that's something that we could set up and do some scanning and profiling.
We could also profile that against like physical size of the athletes, because I know that some of our speed flyers are really quite lean, and others like myself and Shane are quite heavy set, yet Shane's taller than I am, and that whole ratio of mass versus surface area is probably the area where it needs to be compared.
Yeah, interesting research project there, definitely. Okay, what was my other question? Oh, just how much is that, like how many of you are using things like caffeine and those sorts of stimulants for the mental side of things when you're competing? Is that a common practice in your sport, or you don't want to say?
I mean, you want to be heightened and alert, but you don't want to be jittery. You want to be relaxed. So you got to balance that quite nicely.
Yeah.
Also with weather holds and things, so you could be on the ground not jumping for a very long time, and then all of a sudden have a 20-minute call, and you're in the plane doing your performance. So yeah.
And does your competition, is it generally just the one day, or does it go over a series of days?
It depends on weather, but it's generally always multiple days.
Yeah, so that makes it it's harder to manage the caffeine side of things, because again, you don't want to have too much that it affects your sleep, because you know, better quality sleep is probably going to be more beneficial than the stimulatory effect you get from caffeine. So I can think of hundreds of interesting studies that would be useful to do in your particular sport. You know, hopefully some of these get done over the coming years.
I mean, most of us have 8 to 10 rounds, so I mean, if you're doing 8 rounds in a day, that's a very big day. In Europe, they've got longer days, so they've got more sunlight, so they've got opportunities to kind of punch out jumps.
Yeah.
But in Australia, like, it's we've got shorter days. So,
and I imagine that, you know, when you're jumping, there's a whole, you know, production of adrenaline and all those sorts of things. Do you get used to that? Does it become less over time? Or do you always have that, you know, high that you then need to come down from?
I think it's the waiting period that really disrupts a lot of people, like in that uncertainty of the next jump, with poor weather and winds, etc.
Okay.
So if you're going all day, you kind of can keep that energy level up. But if you're stop and starting, it can certainly play on your mental state and physical and everything.
Yeah, so what happens when the competition is all over? Do any of you sort of have this period where you just, you know, almost like an exhausted period where, you know, because you have had all that stimulation and exercise and everything, that you sort of have a few days where you just sort of retreat, or you just generally get back to work and on with it?
I think it depends. Generally, we have a break, but for instance, our nationals, you know, might go for a whole week, but we might just have a couple of days allocated to our discipline. And then sometimes people do compete in multiple disciplines, so they might have a longer period of time. And then it just depends on the timing between the nationals and the world championships. You might only have a short break and then get straight back into training. I think we've got a variety of people here. I think with the team events, they tend to do sort of blocks of training, like a week at a time, and maybe once a month. It really depends on, you know, none of us are heavily sponsored, so we all have work commitments as well. So it's finding the time to train. So I think it's varied between the group.
we see in other sports that there's a lot of focus on, you know, doing all the right things, eating well up to competition and after competition. And then when it's over, people just lose the plot a little bit and, you know, start just eating whatever and having a really poor quality diet. And it can be those periods of time that can be most, I guess, detrimental in terms of, you know, overall body composition and, you know, general health and all those sorts of things. So I do work a lot with athletes in trying to think of what happens after the competition period and how you can maintain all your good eating habits while still relaxing things a little bit without being too obsessive about it. So yeah, that's just thoughts that are going through my head about your particular sport. But I'm asking lots of questions and it's supposed to be for you. So let me just see. Someone's asked about jet lag after long international flights, and recovery food. So in terms of jet lag, the key things seem to be adjusting your time, and I'm sure you're all aware of that. So trying to eat according to the times that you'll be eating when you land at your destination. So rather than just eating when they provide food on the plane, perhaps thinking about, okay, how can I start to adjust my eating cycle in the days leading up to the flight, during the flight, so when I arrive, I'm sort of a bit more sync. Some strategic use of carbohydrate and caffeine. So generally foods with carbohydrate in them tend to help us go to sleep. So thinking about when you want to sleep and maybe having a carbohydrate-based meal then, and then thinking about using caffeine when you want to be awake. So coffee, you know, something simple like that. And generally not overeating. So, you know, when you're on a long flight, you're not doing anything. You're just sitting there, so you don't need the same amount of food that you do in your day-to-day activity. So just, you know, cutting back a little bit, really focusing on hydration. That's really important with any long-haul flights. So drinking regularly to keep yourself hydrated. And those are sort of main things that come out regarding, you know, travel. Anyone else got any tips about managing their travel? Something that works for you? No, so yeah, so they're the main things that you know, athletes, particularly athletes who have to travel and then compete, like some of our rugby teams, for example. We've done a lot of work with them over the years in really giving them really specific advice about what to eat on a flight, and we basically look at each flight individually and think, okay, what timings do we want to adjust? When's the best time to have a meal with carbohydrate? When's the best time to have a smaller meal? You know, those sorts of things. When's the best time to have more protein? So adjusting some of those sorts of things. That's pretty hard to just give some specific, do this, do that.
One thing I've always found with traveling international for myself was both sleep and meal timings adjusted to the time zone you're actually going to. So over a few days before even traveling, slowly working your way into that time zone. So by the time you go through the airports and get jet lagged, you get there, you're already in that sleeping pattern of that time zone. So it's a lot faster to adjust. Yeah.
And your meals can help with that adjustment as well. So, you know, as I said, you might start to have a bigger meal earlier in the day or at lunchtime or something like that, just to sort of get that shift starting to happen. And it does seem to, you know, help people adjust more quickly on the other side. In terms of caffeine, tea can also be a source of caffeine depending on the type of tea and how strong it is. So it could be tea or coffee, whatever your preference is. And it's more just having the caffeine in the earlier part of the day and then saying, okay, no caffeine after midday, for example, so that you can get a better quality sleep that night. So, you know, adjusting some of those timing of your caffeinated products. Okay, I'm just scanning through. I think Ronnie's asked for some good resources. So I will send, I did actually prepare some slides to help answer the questions from the earlier session when I couldn't share because that wasn't set up. So I will send that through to you and I'll give you some link to resources. But I guess one of the resources that I think is really useful for just general information about nutrition and sport is a website by an exercise physiologist called Asker Yerkendrop, and he has a website called My Sport Science. So Asker's someone who, you know, I know really well. He's done a lot of work with the AIS over the years, and he has a website where he tries to, I guess, break down evidence into very practical short snippets of information. So if you go and have a look at My Sports Science, you'll find some really good resources there. So basically when a new piece of evidence comes out, he tries to look at it, assess it from a practical view and reinterpret it in a really simple to understand. And he's just recently hosted an online conference where he's got, you know, a lot of big players basically in the exercise physiology and exercise nutrition world, where you can access an online conference for a very low cost. So if you're particularly interested, that would be, I guess, the standout. There's another one called examine.com, and they do a similar thing in that they try to break down scientific evidence in a very practical way. Their focus is more broad, so it's not just on sport, it's basically on all nutrition evidence, so that's a good one to have a look at as well. So they would be two that stand out. There's also the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, and it is Gatorade, so you know their job is to sell Gatorade, but they do have they employ some good sports scientists. And they kind of have these two arms. They have their sort of scientific arm, and then they have their commercial arm where they're just trying to put out new products of different colours and sell as many as they can. But the science arm of Gatorade is still very strong and reliable, and some good stuff comes out of there. So, yeah, they're good sources. Of course, you can go to Sports Dietitians Australia. They have fact sheets. They're sort of more targeted at the very recreational, really sort of basic level. And the AIS still does put some communication out from time to time. Their focus has changed more recently. So with a new funding model, they've been told to focus more at the elite level and not do any of their public communication. So that's dropped off a little bit, but they're still useful as well. So yeah, I'll send you through some slides that I'd already put together that just sort of go through some of the questions that we've talked about and include some good sources of information on there for you, so that can be distributed. Any final questions before we finish up? If not, okay, well, it's been good talking to you and thinking about your sport. So intriguing, some of the stuff that you do. I was like, yeah, I love seeing all the videos that Ronnie sent through. Like, I had no idea that it was such, I guess, a varied sport. So it was really fascinating to see it. So very impressed by what you people do. Stay safe doing it.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks so much for your time. I think everyone has got a lot out of it.
Thanks, Michelle.
No worries. So I'll send that stuff through and Ronnie can circulate it.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Thank you.
Okay, see ya.